Hello, Toby.
Hello, Nancy. Good morning.
Hello, Toby. Can I see you? Good morning. I heard your voice before seeing your face. Okay, now I see you. Welcome to the program, Toby. Now, we're looking at the 2021 GDP data. Interpret those figures for me. You know, so much figures. When you go on the NBS website now, you see an episode of both text and numbers. Interpret that GDP numbers or the GDP data. Break it down for our viewers.
Okay. So the first thing I want to say is don't be intimidated by the numbers. Numbers actually tell stories, right? So um, I will be telling us the stories and not bombarding us too much with the figures. So the first quarter of the year, 2021, grew by 0.51%, um, which follows the recession exiting quarter of Q4 last year, which grew by 0.11%. In other words, the economy is confirmed out of recession and is growing at a faster pace than it did when it exited the recession. Um, the current real GDP figure for the first quarter of the year is currently at 16.83 trillion. Um, and then if you compare, Nigeria has witnessed a recession in recent times also in 2016. If we look at the quarters following the recession, which were Q2 2017 and Q3 2017, we can see that although we've exited this COVID-19 induced recession, we have exited at a slower pace than we did the last recession. So just for a bit of perspective, we exited the last recession at 0.5% immediately after the recession and 1.4% in the subsequent quarter. Meanwhile, here we're looking at 0.11% exiting the recession and 0.51 the subsequent quarter. So we've exited, but it's at a slower pace. Nonetheless, it is good news. And just for further breakdown, um, the oil sector, the oil sector GDP contributed 9.25% to the GDP, while the non-oil GDP contributed 90.75% in this quarter. And then, things that drove this recovery, right? So oil production, for instance, in Nigeria for the first quarter was an average of 1.72 million barrels per day, which was up from last quarter's 1.56 million barrels per day. Also, we can see that the price of crude oil has started, trending upwards as the world economy begins to open, and there's more demand. So that coupled with the increase in production, bodes well for the economy. And also the top gaining sectors in the actually, before I get to that, I think it's important to note the sectors that contribute the highest to the GDP of the nation, being agriculture, manufacturing, trade, construction, and then information and technology, in particular telecoms. So of these, um, the agriculture sector actually grew during the quarter by 2.28%. Manufacturing grew by 3.4%. I mean, those two alone growing is a very good indicator for the economy because they account for a substantial amount of the GDP of the economy. And then telecoms grew, but telecoms grew at a slower pace than it did during the last quarter, right? And I mean, there are many factors responsible for this. First of all, the economy has started opening. There's less demand for data because people have started reverting to their, partially to their normal lifestyles or change from, the adoption of technology for having meetings like we're having now is here to stay, but it will not be at the level of the COVID-19, the heat of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then there was also the issue um, of the halting of new SIM cards in the telecom space, which not just affected some of the profitability figures, but as you can see, is affecting the GDP of that particular sector.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. No.
Do you think that Nigeria is really out of the pandemic-induced recession? I know we're out of a recession. We came out of a recession last quarter of last year. But why I ask that question is because where we were in the last quarter and where we are now, one may say is significant. But are we really out of, are we really out of the intensive care unit, so to speak, of the ICU?
So let me also point out that the GDP growth rates we have experienced over the last 2 quarters, in fact, even this is 0.51%, is nothing compared to the levels we saw pre-pandemic, which averaged, not of 2%, right? And there's still the scare of another wave of the COVID-19 pandemic with the Indian strain, entering the borders of Nigeria and all of that. So I would say we're still at a very fragile point. Overall, it's positive. It's a very positive outlook for the economy, but we're still at a very fragile point. We'll still need to record another quarter of higher quarterly economic growth to be able to say that we are completely out of the waters. So, yeah.
If we take a look at some of those sectors, let's try to break it down. I know you did that earlier on. The Nigerian economy is classified into 2 sectors, oil and non-oil sector. The non-oil sector contributed so much to the GDP, but we're not seeing the FX component of that contribution because the oil sector, which contributes not so much, very minute, or not as much as the non-oil sector, still contributing FX close to 70%. To the pool of money that we need in the country. Can you just quickly break down the non-oil sector? Of course, the ICT sector, we know that is the telecommunications part that contributed a lot. Manufacturing, agriculture, and all of that. Just make us understand those numbers the more.
Okay, so if I got you correctly, a breakdown of the non-oil sector's contribution to the GDP. Right. So, like I mentioned earlier, agriculture, despite the insecurity in the country, despite the infrastructure deficits in terms of transportation to move goods, agriculture still grew by 2.28%, which is very commendable. The other key non-oil sectors that drove this performance were manufacturing. So as the economy begins to open, there's naturally more demand. Companies and firms in the consumer, for instance, the consumer goods sector would definitely see an increase in demand just by virtue of the pickup of the economy at large. This will definitely affect this definitely contributed to the manufacturing sector figures that we have seen, which grew by over 3%. And then ICT continues to contribute to the economy. Real estate, which has been negative over the past couple of quarters, has since the last quarter recorded and to this quarter has seen a positive performance. So real estate grew by 1.77%. So all of these, like I said, numbers.
So perhaps that is good news for the cement manufacturers.
Yes. So
yes, because it also reflected in some of their earnings. Some of these companies listed on the stock exchange, it manifested in their earnings that we saw. And I was like, oh, we're in a pandemic, we're in a lockdown, real estate is growing, cement manufacturers are making more money. They're going to make more money, for example.
Exactly. And just like the speaker before me said, would it's like a chicken and egg issue, right? So one leads to the other, and the other leads to that one. So we would see the um, equities market as well as the companies that contribute, that make up the equities markets, begin to reflect some of these figures. So yes.
If we take a look at the recovery efforts from this administration, do you think that it is garnering some effects with these GDP numbers that we're seeing? Because during the pandemic, or during the lockdown precisely, we saw intervention measures coming for different sectors, the health sector, MSMEs and co. What do you think that government can do? What additional things can government do so that we can rebound stronger?
Mm. So I mean, the fact that that contrary to popular, um, I won't just say opinion, but contrary to popular forecast, we have exited the recession much quicker than a lot of people initially anticipated, right? Shows that the government is actually doing some things right, doing a lot of things right, actually. But that said, to go to your question, I mean, we hear these things over and over again, the kind of things that government can do to improve the economy, which is reflected by GDP in this case. And like we said, for one of them is focusing on infrastructure because it's such a key part of any economy. It's to lower the cost of economic activity. It will lead to higher productivity, and then that will lead to higher outputs. That will, at the end of the day, it will do so much good for not just the economy, but the social welfare of the nation. Another thing is addressing this issue of insecurity in the country. It has escalated very seriously in recent times. Um, and it is, I mean, the effects are very um, far-reaching. It has a direct correlation with not just in investor sentiment when looking at the country, both local and foreign investors, but also in terms of things like supply chain, transportation of goods and services, even production, agriculture, the culture sector, crop production, and all of that, which, as we discussed earlier, contributes a very significant portion to the GDP of the nation. If the insecurity issue is tackled, or at least reduced significantly, we would see, I mean, the GDP figures we're seeing now would pale in comparison to what we'll see then. And then another thing I want to point out is the education sector, right? So education is a driver of long-term investment in education, of long-term economic growth anywhere. And if we look at the GDP figures for education, they're not very impressive. Last quarter, it declined by 6.2%. And last year, it's again declined by 13.57. Although we can say this is due to lockdown, you know, children not being able to go to schools and all of that. There's clearly a problem there. If the government also prioritizes this area, not only contributes to the GDP, but it contributes to the future progress of the country. It contributes to the productivity of Nigeria's biggest resource, which is its people, right? So the more educated the people you have, the more productive they are. So it has that, that multiplier effect. So these are the three areas. I don't want to repeat a lot of the cliche, a lot of what we already know, the government. So these are the three areas.
Now, are you also a bit surprised with what is happening right now in terms of sectors' contribution to real GDP? Services, of course, since when we rebased in 2014, I think so, we rebased our GDP, either 2013 or 2014, we saw that after that rebasing, services sectors came up on top with about 51%. With these GDP numbers that we have now, the services sector is at around 53.9%. Industries is second, about 23.7 or so. Agriculture is third with 22.5% or so. Yes, 22.35%. What does this really say? The composition about how the size of our economy, the composition of it. So a lot of us are involved in services.
So I mean, this really bodes well for the Nigerian economy going forward, because there's been the talk of diversification, right? And this shows, even if not at the level that most people want to see, this shows that other areas of the economy are beginning to grow and beginning to get attention. We might say that, especially if we go to, for instance, maybe fintech, right? A lot of the growth there is driven by external funding, external investments. Nonetheless, this just shows that the government should pay extra attention to some of these sectors, services especially, because if you look at the major economies of the world, their services sectors are huge. So it's a positive move in the area of diversification of the economy, and it's a welcome development. So yes, I don't know if that.
Okay, Tobi, just final question before we go. We have less than 2 minutes. If you take a look at the yearly GDP growth rate from 2012 till now, with what the data says, we've seen the highest growth rates in 2013 and 2014. In 2015, we saw a growth rate of about 2.79%. 2016, we went into a recession. 2020, we went into a recession. So this administration have had it so rough and bad. Thank you guys for putting that, because those are the figures I want us to analyze now. The highest, at least in the last how many years, from 2012 to now, has been 2014, followed by 2013. What does this really say? What were we doing from 2012 to 2014, at least, leaving 2015, that we grew just slightly ahead of the population rate? What did we do in 2012 to 2014 that we couldn't do in 2015 till now, that has made, that has really contracted our GDP? What really stifled it, those numbers?
Honestly, this.
Why did you giggle?
Would be conjecture, and it would just be because to be able to give an accurate answer, right, an analysis will need to be done for each of these years, in their own unique context. I can tell you that, from since the global economic meltdown, we haven't seen GDP figures. That's since 2016, right? We haven't seen the kind of GDP growth figures annually that we saw between 2012 and 2015. The lowest was 2015, which was 2.79. The highest we have seen post global economic meltdown is 2.27%, right? So it just shows. I mean, I can say that we haven't fully, the economy of Nigeria and the world entirely hasn't fully recovered from the effect of that particular occurrence, which had such a, it's second only to this coronavirus pandemic that we've seen.
Okay.
So
what you're telling us right now is that we should dig into those numbers, definitely. Perhaps it should be a research paper for some PhD students or some people doing their projects, that why did we grow at that point, from 2012, or even take it further than 2012? What did we do at that point that we're not doing now, So anyway, I've pushed the button. Thank you very much, Tobi, for coming on the show.